Are you someone who lives with moderate to high levels of fear or anxiety, the kind where you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop or scanning for what could go wrong or mentally preparing for worst case scenarios before anything has ever even happened? For many people, anxiety isn't just a feeling that comes and goes, it becomes a lens through which life is perceived. Even neutral situations can feel charged and uncertain and can feel unbearable to many. I grew up in a high anxiety family, so fear and vigilance were a part of the emotional atmosphere I was raised in. That shaped my nervous system and my personality. I can still have anxious tendencies today for sure, but the difference is that the anxiety no longer runs my life. I have way more tools, a different relationship to fear, and most importantly, a different story about what anxiety actually is, right? My seat of awareness has shifted. Anxiety still arises at times for sure, but it no longer engulfs me the way it once did. What used to be a constant baseline state has become more situational and temporary. There was a time in my life when fear based anxiety was the foundation of my personality. That state played a huge role in my addiction. Drugs and alcohol were how I tried to escape a nervous system that never felt safe. Today, when anxiety flares up, it's usually under very specific conditions, like when I'm overstimulated or feeling pulled in too many directions at once, or having too many things to focus on in my environment at once, or maybe being really late to something important. These moments feel more like isolated perfect storm type situations rather than the permanent state of dread and anxiety I used to live in. There were many things that helped me dismantle this fear-based prison, but in this episode I'm going to share one practice that changed my relationship to anxiety at a foundational level. It's unconventional, simple, rarely talked about, and it doesn't require you to think positively your way out of fear. In this episode, I'll share exactly what it is, how to use it. So, if fear and anxiety have been running your life, I really encourage you to stick around. When I was living in chronic anxiety, it would have been nearly impossible to convince me that what I was experiencing was a distorted perception. I would have also been offended if someone suggested that my anxiety means I lack faith or trust. And hearing phrases like, just don't worry so much, or everything happens for a reason, or just let it go, only made things worse. Those statements often feel dismissive when our nervous system is in survival mode. You may have heard the phrase, just give it to God, especially during moments of stress, uncertainty, or powerlessness. Just give it to God. And for some people, that phrase brings comfort, and giving it to God can be actually an easier concept to understand if one views God as a personified, separate entity that one is turning something over to. For others, the concept of just give it to God can feel vague or abstract or even frustrating, and it can especially feel inaccessible if you don't view God as a personified or separate being who intervenes in human affairs. Now, everyone has a different relationship to the concept of God or higher power, and that relationship needs to be cultivated on an individual basis. That's very important. And for more details on this, please check out my episode titled Touching God Blindfolded and my episode titled The Secret to Resilience. Regardless of this concept, some call it God, others call it the Tao, Source, the Great Spirit, the Ineffable One, or simply higher power. Language is limited and inherently dualistic, so the name is not the point. The relationship is. The name is not the point. For many people, especially those who do not experience God as a ruler or authority or a separate being, but rather as an uncreated, unchanging essence that expresses itself through everything, the idea of turning it over can feel confusing. If nothing exists outside this source, and if everything is already an expression of it, then what exactly are we giving something to? And how do we practice trust or surrender when there is no external being to hand things over to, only an intelligence that is already moving through us through life itself? This question is where many people, including myself, would get stuck. The concept feels meaningful, but abstract, intellectually interesting, but hard to embody. And without a way to bring it into a lived experience, it can remain just another spiritual idea rather than something that actually softens fear and anxiety in real time. That's why the practice I'm about to share is so powerful, because it takes this abstract idea of turning it over and gives it form, structure, and evidence you can feel and see for yourself, no matter what your concept of God is. The practice I want to share is a physical ritual that helps translate this abstract idea into something tangible. It's commonly called a God box, though it can be a God bag or container you keep with you. The purpose of this practice is to build evidence that life is not entirely dependent on your constant vigilance, control, and worry. I once worked with this beautiful young woman who lived in a near constant state of fear and anxiety. Instead of a God box, I provided her with one of those small cloth bags that she could keep in her purse, a God sack, if you will. I gave her a stack of small pieces of paper with one of those little pencils, and I asked her to write down any fear or anxious thought that became a focal point in her mind, and then she would place that in the bag. I had her carry that bag in her purse so it would go everywhere with her, right? After 2 weeks, the bag was absolutely packed. We sat down together and we went through every single piece of paper one by one. One by one, we sorted them into two piles: resolved and unresolved. To her surprise, almost everything had resolved itself without her intervention. The unresolved pile was tiny. We repeated this process over a couple times, and something remarkable happened. The bag became lighter. The number of fears being written down decreased dramatically over a relatively short period of time. She began to see clearly that the issue wasn't that life was constantly dangerous, it was that her mind was constantly bracing. This practice helped her soften that grasping mind. Instead of forcing solutions or mentally rehearsing every possible outcome, she began to rest in the intelligence that already knows how to move life forward. She was still taking action when needed, but without the tension of needing to mentally control everything. She wasn't becoming a passive observer, but rather she was building trust through concrete evidence. Things resolve themselves. The concept of a God box wasn't something I invented. You might have heard it before. I was introduced to it in my early sobriety, but I slightly modified the practice. I was personally told to put my fears in the box, but there was really no instruction beyond that, at least for me. And my personal beliefs do not view God as a separate entity or an authority or a personified being, so I was really confused. The people who were walking me through this exercise were these wonderful Christian women who I love very much, and I had a hard time conveying the question that I mentioned to you guys earlier to them, the question of how can I practice trust or turning it over when there is no external being to hand things over to, only an essence that is already moving through us through life itself from my personal beliefs. And that was hard for me to ask that question and get an answer from. So I was confused. I wasn't getting much answers on that, and it was kind of like, put these fears in a box and give it to God, and you don't need to look at them again. But that helped a little bit, but not much. I was still like, now what? Like, now what? The real shift for me personally came when I began revisiting the box and seeing how often things resolve themselves, often in ways I could have never planned. That process helped me slowly release attachment to outcomes while staying engaged with life. Even the fears that remained unresolved, especially the big blanket fears, something like, I'm afraid something bad will happen to someone I love, began to soften. Not because they disappeared, because Trust had grown. I developed more capacity to live with uncertainty without panic. I learned that confusion, loss, and not knowing are also movements of the same intelligence that brings clarity and growth. The practice is simple. Get a box, a bag, or any container and designate it as your God box. And if you don't like that name, choose a different name. When fear or anxiety arises, write it down and place it inside. Do this fully for a period of time, but whatever period you designate for yourself. After this time, revisit the contents and separate them into resolved and unresolved. Repeat this process regularly or as often as you need so you can let the evidence accumulate. Over time, you'll likely find that you stop trying to dominate reality and start listening to how life, this divine essence, whatever your higher power is moving through you or working for you. If there's one thing I know to be true for me is that peace does not come from control. It comes from remembering how to flow and how to trust in whatever higher power you have. But this God box exercise helped me see evidence that things are always working out for me. Otherwise, the concept's a little too abstract for me. Now, keep in mind, this isn't an on and off switch, it's a practice. And like any practice, it changes you slowly from the inside out. Let me know if you try this practice and how you do. And as always, have a good week.